I'm Dorothy Chen, 58, a cardiothoracic surgeon who built my life around saving others and raising my son David. 3 weeks before his wedding, my future daughter-in-law Jessica delivered an ultimatum. I was no longer welcome at their ceremony. The reason, she claimed, I was too controlling and didn't respect boundaries. I was devastated after losing my husband 5 years ago. David was everything to me. But as I stood in that church, uninvited and heartbroken, watching through the back doors, the minister's words stopped everyone cold. What happened next would reveal a truth that changed everything, not just about Jessica, but about the family I thought I knew. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt rejected by those you love most, like this video. Looking at David's medical school graduation photo on my mantle, I still remember the pride that swelled in my chest that day. My husband Robert had been gone for only 6 months then, but somehow I'd managed to hold it together long enough to see our son achieve his dream. That photo represents everything I sacrificed: the long hours at the hospital to pay for his education, the sleepless nights studying alongside him, the social events I missed to support his ambitions. David was always exceptional. Even as a child, he possessed an empathy that made him perfect for medicine. When other kids were playing video games, he was reading about the human heart, literally and figuratively. After Robert's sudden cardiac arrest, David held my hand through the funeral arrangements, promising he'd never leave me alone. "Mom, we're a team now," he'd whispered that night, "just you and me against the world." For 3 years, we were exactly that. David would call me every evening from his residency, sharing his cases, asking for advice. We'd meet for dinner twice a week, and he'd spend most weekends at the house where he grew up. I wasn't just his mother, I was his confidant, his anchor, his closest friend. Then Jessica appeared. I first met her at David's hospital Christmas party 2 years ago. She was beautiful, certainly blonde hair, perfectly styled, designer dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. But what struck me wasn't her appearance. It was how she seemed to study everyone in the room, cataloging details like a detective gathering evidence. "Mrs. Chen," she'd said, extending a manicured hand, "I've heard so much about you. David absolutely adores you." Her smile was perfect, but something about it felt rehearsed. Still, I was determined to like her. David's happiness was my priority, and he seemed genuinely smitten. "Please, call me Dorothy," I replied, noting how she positioned herself between David and me throughout the evening. The first few months were pleasant enough. Jessica was charming, attentive, and made David laugh in ways I hadn't heard since before his father died. She'd join us for our weekly dinners, contributing to conversations with just enough medical knowledge to seem informed, but not enough to appear threatening to David's expertise. But slowly, subtly, things began to change. Jessica would suggest that David looked tired, that perhaps he was working too hard. She'd mention how other couples their age were traveling, exploring the world together. She'd bring up how dependent some adult children were on their parents, speaking in general terms, but glancing meaningfully at David. "Don't you think it's time you had your own life?" she'd ask him one evening when I called during their dinner. I could hear her voice clearly through the phone, though she probably thought I couldn't. The weekly dinners became monthly. The nightly phone calls shortened to brief check-ins when I'd invite them over for Sunday brunch, a tradition Robert and I had started when David was in college. Jessica would often have other plans. "Mom, we're adults now," David would say, when I expressed concern. "We can't revolve our lives around family dinners." The words stung because they sounded like Jessica, not like the son who used to tell me everything. The text messages on my phone told a story I didn't want to believe. Scrolling through months of increasingly desperate attempts to connect with my son, I could see the pattern emerging like symptoms of a disease I'd failed to diagnose in time. "Hi honey, just checking in. How was your day?" Delivered, but no response. "Saw an interesting case today that reminded me of something you told me. Call when you can. Read, but silence. Missing you. Are you free for lunch this weekend?" 3 days later. "Sorry mom, busy." Jessica had moved in 6 months after they started dating. I should have recognized the strategic timing right after David's lease expired. When he was stressed about finding a new place, she'd suggested they save money by living together, framing it as practical rather than romantic. "It makes sense, Dorothy," she'd explained when they told me. "We're both responsible adults, and rent in this city is ridiculous." I'd nodded and smiled, but something cold settled in my stomach. This felt like the beginning of something I couldn't name, but instinctively feared. The changes started small. David would mention plans I hadn't heard about, friends I'd never met. When I'd ask about his work, he'd give vague responses, instead of the detailed stories he used to share. The son, who once sought my advice on everything from patient care to personal decisions, was becoming a stranger. "Maybe you're being too involved," my colleague Sarah Martinez suggested one day when I confided my concerns. "He's 32, Dorothy. It's natural for him to prioritize his relationship." But this wasn't natural. I'd raised David to be independent while maintaining our close bond. I'd encouraged his relationships, celebrated his achievements, and supported his dreams. I'd never been the overbearing mother who couldn't let go. The real confirmation came during a dinner at their apartment. I'd brought David's favorite dessert, the chocolate cake I'd made for every birthday since he was 5. As I was setting it on the counter, I noticed Jessica's laptop was open to a web page about toxic mother-in-law relationships. "Oh, that's just research for a friend," she'd said quickly, closing the laptop. "She's having some family issues." That night, I lay awake thinking about the articles I'd glimpsed. Signs your mother-in-law is too controlling. How to set boundaries with intrusive in-laws. Breaking free from maternal manipulation. The next morning, I called David. "Can we talk, just the two of us?" "About what, Mom?" "About us. About our relationship. I feel like I'm losing you." There was a long pause. "Jessica thinks maybe we should all spend some time apart. To establish healthier boundaries, Jessica thinks. Not I think or we think, Jessica thinks." "What does that mean, exactly?" "Maybe we don't need to talk every day. Maybe we can see each other less frequently, give Jessica and me space to build our own life." Each word felt like a scalpel cutting through my heart. This was my son, my David, speaking words that sounded foreign in his voice. "I love you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've always just wanted you to be happy." "I know, Mom, but sometimes love can be." He paused, and I heard Jessica's voice in the background. "Sometimes love can be suffocating." Suffocating. The word echoed in my mind for days. I'd dedicated my life to helping people breathe, to repairing hearts so they could pump life through damaged bodies. How had my love become something that stole breath instead of giving it? I learned about my son's engagement the same way hundreds of other people did, through a Facebook post. There they were, David and Jessica, posed perfectly in front of a sunset, her left hand strategically positioned to catch the light on what looked like a very expensive ring. She said yes. "Can't wait to spend forever with this amazing woman. #engaged, #blessed, #future Mrs. The comments poured in immediately. Congratulations from friends, family members, colleagues. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring. Surely David would call, to tell me personally. Surely this was just their way of announcing it to the world after they'd already told the people who mattered most. The call never came. I waited 3 hours before I couldn't stand it anymore. When I called, Jessica answered David's phone. "Dorothy, I was wondering when you'd call." "Congratulations," I managed, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I'm so happy for you both." "Thank you." David's in the shower, but I know he's excited to start planning the wedding, of course. We're thinking something intimate, small, just close family and friends. There was something in her tone, a subtle emphasis on close, that made my chest tighten. "That sounds lovely. Have you set a date?" "We're thinking 6 months." David's always been one to jump in with both feet. I didn't know that about David. My David was methodical, careful, someone who researched every decision thoroughly. But apparently, this David, Jessica's David, was impulsive. When David finally called back 2 hours later, he sounded different. Excited, yes, but also somehow distant. "Mom, I wanted to tell you personally, but Jessica was so excited she posted it right away. I'm happy for you, sweetheart. Really happy. I know you'll love planning with us." Jessica has such great taste. Planning with us, the phrase should have warmed my heart, but something about it felt hollow. Over the next few weeks, I kept waiting for that planning conversation. I'd call with ideas about venues, offer to help with costs, suggest vendors. I'd worked with 4 hospital events. Each time, I was met with polite deflection. "We've got it handled, Mom. Jessica already found someone for that. We want to keep it simple." The ring receipt I later found tucked in David's medical journal told a different story. $15,000 for a 2-carat diamond solitaire. The payment method showed it came from David's savings account, the same account I'd helped him build by paying for his car, his insurance, his phone bill, even after he'd started earning his own money. I'd never cared about the money. I'd given it gladly, proudly, the way parents do when they want to see their children succeed. But seeing that receipt, knowing David had spent his entire savings on a ring for a woman who was systematically erasing me from his life, felt like a betrayal I couldn't articulate. The engagement party was announced via another social media post, a casual gathering at their apartment. The post said, "Come, celebrate with us." But when I asked David about it, he seemed surprised I'd seen the invitation. "Oh, it's just a small thing. Jessica's friends, mostly. You know how those parties can be, lots of people you don't know. I'd like to meet Jessica's friends, and I'd like to celebrate my son's engagement. Of course, Mom, of course you're invited." But the invitation never came. Not formally, not informally. The night of the party, I drove past their apartment building and saw the lights blazing, heard the laughter floating down from their third-floor windows. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, debating whether to go up. In the end, I drove home and looked at more Facebook photos. Jessica radiant in a white dress, David beaming beside her, surrounded by people I'd never seen before. In every photo, they looked like the perfect couple, ready to start their perfect life, without me. The venue contract arrived in my mailbox. 3 weeks after the engagement party I wasn't invited to, my name was listed as the financial guarantor for the Grandview Country Club, a signature I'd never provided, for an event I'd never agreed to fund. I stared at the papers, my hands trembling slightly. The total cost was staggering: $42,000 for venue, catering, flowers, and photography. But more disturbing than the amount was the realization that somehow Jessica had used my information to secure the booking. When I called David, my voice was carefully controlled, despite the storm raging inside me. "David, I need to ask you about something. Did you give Jessica my financial information?" "What? No, Mom. Why would you ask that?" "Because I just received a contract for your wedding venue, with my name as the guarantor." Silence, then, "Let me call you back." An hour later, he called with an explanation that sounded rehearsed. "Jessica made a mistake. She thought you'd offered to help with the venue, so she put your name down as a placeholder. We'll fix it right away." "I did offer to help, David. I offered to contribute to your wedding, but I'd like to be involved in the planning if I'm going to be involved in the paying." "We don't need your money, Mom. The contract suggests otherwise." Another pause. "Jessica handles the planning. She's better at that stuff than I am. I planned your father's and my wedding. I think I can handle helping with yours." That was different. That was a different time. Different time, as if the principles of love, family, and celebration had somehow evolved beyond my understanding in the decades since I'd walked down the aisle. Over the following weeks, I made several attempts to insert myself into the planning process. I offered to host a bridal shower, to help with invitations, to coordinate with vendors. Each offer was met with polite refusal. "We've got it covered. Jessica's sister is handling that. We want to keep it simple." Simple. Yet the venue contract suggested anything but simplicity. The menu description included imported oysters, premium bar service, and a 7-course tasting menu. The floral arrangements featured peonies in December, a choice that would cost more than most people's monthly salary. I began to understand that simple was Jessica's code for without Dorothy's input. The breaking point came when I ran into the wedding photographer at the hospital. Maria Santos had photographed several staff events, and she mentioned she was excited to work on David's wedding. "Your son seems lovely," she said, "though I have to say, his fiancée is quite specific about what she wants." "Oh," she insisted on a specific shot list. "No photos of the groom with his mother during the ceremony, no mother-son dance," she said. It was too traditional, too focused on the past instead of the future. The words hit me like a physical blow. No mother-son dance. The dance I'd dreamed about since David was born, that dance Robert and I had discussed, wondering what song David would choose, what he'd whisper in my ear as we swayed together. That night, I called David one more time. "I understand you want Jessica to plan your wedding," I said. "But I need to understand why I'm being excluded from what should be family traditions." "You're not being excluded, Mom. You're being dramatic." "No mother-son dance, David. No photos of us together. Jessica thinks those traditions are outdated. She wants our wedding to be about us, not about family obligations. Family obligations. My love for my son had become an obligation. My presence at his wedding had become a burden. I see, I said quietly. And what do you think? I think Jessica knows more about weddings than I do. I think she wants our day to be perfect, and I would make it imperfect. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. The conversation ended with David sighing heavily and promising to call me later. He never did. The final insult came in the form of a wedding invitation that arrived 2 months before the ceremony. My name was spelled incorrectly, Dorothy, instead of Dorothy, and I was listed as Mrs. Chen rather than Dr. Chen, despite Jessica knowing full well that I'd worked 30 years to earn that title. But the real message was in the seating chart that fell out of the envelope. I was seated at table 12, in the back corner, with distant relatives and family friends, not at the head table, not even close to it. I was being erased from my son's wedding, one detail at a time. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed out and hand-delivered to my office by Jessica herself. She walked past my secretary, past the residents who tried to stop her, and placed the folded paper directly on my desk while I was reviewing surgical notes. I think it's time we had an honest conversation, she said. Settling into the chair across from my desk without invitation, I looked at the printed email, formal, typed with bullet points like a business proposal. The subject line read, regarding your attendance at our wedding. Jessica, what is this? It's a list of incidents that have made David and me uncomfortable. We think it would be best if you didn't attend the wedding. I read the first few lines, my blood growing cold with each word. Incident 1. Attempting to control wedding planning by inserting yourself into vendor discussions without invitation. Incident 2. Making inappropriate comments about wedding costs and financial decisions that are not your concern. Incident 3. Displaying jealous and possessive behavior regarding David's time and attention. The list continued for 2 pages. Every interaction we'd had over the past 18 months, twisted and reframed as evidence of my supposed toxicity. Offering to help with wedding planning became attempting to control. Expressing concern about their financial choices became inappropriate interference. Missing my son when our relationship changed became possessive behavior. This is insane, I said, looking up at Jessica. These are lies, are they? Or are you just unable to see how your behavior affects other people? Jessica leaned forward, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, cold, calculating, almost clinical. David has been struggling with this for months. He loves you, but he can't live under your constant scrutiny anymore. He needs space to become his own man. I raised him to be his own man. Or did you raise him to be dependent on your approval for everything? The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it. I had been involved in David's life, deeply lovingly involved. But dependence, had I really created that? I've never asked David to choose between us, I said carefully, haven't you? Every time you question our decisions, every time you offer unsolicited advice, every time you make him feel guilty for not calling or visiting enough, you're asking him to choose. Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Would you like to hear what he really thinks? She pressed play on a voice recording. David's voice filled my office. Tired and frustrated. I just wish she could let me be happy. Jess, why does everything have to be about her feelings? Why can't she just trust that I'm capable of making my own decisions? The recording continued for several minutes. My son, venting his frustrations about me to the woman who was systematically destroying our relationship. His words weren't cruel, but they were distant, exasperated. Nothing like the loving son who used to confide in me about everything. How long have you been recording him? I asked. I document concerning behavior. It's important to have evidence when dealing with toxic family dynamics. Toxic family dynamics. Dorothy, I know this is hard to hear, but David deserves to start his marriage without the burden of managing your emotions. He deserves a wife who supports his independence, not a mother who undermines it. I looked at the printed email again, at the formal language and legal-sounding accusations. This wasn't the passionate outburst of an overwhelmed bride. This was a calculated campaign. What do you want from me? I want you to not attend our wedding. I want you to give David space to grow into the man he's meant to be. I want you to respect our boundaries and stop trying to control our relationship. And if I refuse, Jessica smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, then you'll lose him completely. Right now, he still loves you. He still wants a relationship with you, just a healthier one. But if you force him to choose between his mother and his wife on his wedding day, what do you think he'll choose?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I knew the answer, and so did she. "I need time to think about this. The wedding is in 3 weeks. I need an answer by Friday." Jessica stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced precision. "For what it's worth, Dorothy, I don't hate you. I actually admire how much you love David. But love without boundaries isn't love, it's control, and David deserves better than that." After she left, I sat in my office for an hour, reading and rereading the printed accusations. Each point was technically true but stripped of context, twisted to support a narrative I didn't recognize. Had I really been controlling, possessive, toxic, or had I simply loved my son too much to see that someone was teaching him to interpret that love as a prison? Dr. Sarah Martinez found me crying in the hospital chapel an hour after Jessica left my office. As the head of our psychiatric consultation service, Sarah had a gift for reading people, and she took one look at my tear-stained face before sliding into the pew beside me. "Want to talk about it?" I handed her Jessica's printed ultimatum without a word. Sarah read it slowly, her expression growing more concerned with each line. "Dorothy, this is manipulative as hell, is it, or am I really the problem?" Sarah turned to face me fully, her dark eyes serious. "I've known you for 8 years. I've watched you with patients, with residents, with your colleagues. You're direct, yes. You're passionate about the people you care about, but toxic, controlling, no." She held up the paper. "This reads like a textbook case of psychological manipulation. Look at the language. It's designed to make you question your own perceptions, your own memories." But David agreed with it. "She played me a recording." "Of course she did. After months of conditioning him to see your love as suffocation, your concern as control." Sarah folded the paper carefully. "Dorothy, has David ever complained about your relationship before Jessica came along?" I thought back to all our years together, the late-night study sessions, the medical discussions, the quiet dinners after Robert died. "Never. He used to say I was his best friend. And now suddenly you're toxic." People don't fundamentally change their relationship patterns overnight unless someone is influencing that change. Sarah's words gave me the first moment of clarity I'd had in months. This wasn't about my failures as a mother, this was about Jessica's success as a manipulator. What do I do? First, you don't make any decisions based on ultimatums. Second, you let me do some digging. Sarah held up her hospital badge. "This little card gives me access to a lot of databases. Sometimes it's helpful to know who we're really dealing with." "You do that, Dorothy. You saved my daughter's life when she had that heart defect. You stayed in surgery for 14 hours because you refused to give up on a 6-year-old girl. I'd do anything for you." That afternoon, Sarah began her investigation. Her first stop was the hospital's credentialing database, where she could verify Jessica's claims about her background. Jessica had mentioned working in healthcare administration, having a master's degree in public health, and growing up in Connecticut. "Nothing," Sarah reported back the next morning. "No record of her in any healthcare system in this state. No verification of her educational credentials. Maybe she worked in a different state. Maybe. But Dorothy, she's been living here for 2 years. If she was really in healthcare, she'd have transferred her credentials by now." Sarah's next step was more thorough. Using her connections in the psychiatric community, she reached out to colleagues in Connecticut, asking discreet questions about anyone matching Jessica's description. The first red flag came from Dr. Michael Torres at Yale New Haven Hospital. "Funny you should ask," he told Sarah during a phone call I overheard. "We had someone matching that description apply for a position about 3 years ago. Beautiful, charming, claimed to have experience in medical administration, but when we checked her references, nothing matched up." "What happened?" "She disappeared. Never showed up for the final interview. Left a message saying she'd had a family emergency." Sarah's investigation expanded. She contacted medical facilities across New England, asking about Jessica Monroe. The name David's fiancée had given us. No records. No employment history. No educational verification. "It's like she didn't exist before she met David," Sarah told me. The breakthrough came when Sarah decided to run Jessica's image through a reverse photo search. The engagement photos David had posted on social media yielded an unexpected result. Same woman in similar photos, but with different names, different men, different stories. "Look at this," Sarah said, pulling up her laptop in my office. This is from a society page in Hartford, Connecticut. Jessica Williams and fiancé Marcus Patterson announced their engagement. The photo is from 18 months ago. I stared at the screen. It was definitely Jessica, but with dark hair instead of blonde, wearing a different ring, smiling beside a man who looked remarkably like David's similar age, similar profession based on the caption identifying him as a surgeon. There's more, Sarah continued, clicking through browser tabs. Jessica Martinez in Boston, engaged to Dr. James Rodriguez. Jessica Thompson in Providence, engaged to Dr. Andrew Kim. The pattern is always the same: young doctors, successful careers, close relationships with their mothers. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to be certain. Could these be coincidences? Maybe she has a common face. Dorothy. Look at the details. Each engagement was announced 6 to 8 months after meeting. Each time, she claims to work in healthcare administration. Each time, the engagement photos show expensive rings, expensive venues, expensive tastes. Sarah pulled up one more webpage news article from the Hartford Courant, dated 8 months ago. Local doctor loses life savings to wedding scam. The article detailed how Dr. Marcus Patterson had lost nearly $60,000 to a woman who disappeared 3 weeks before their wedding, taking with her the deposits for venue, catering, and honeymoon, as well as gaining access to his bank accounts and credit cards. She's a con artist, I whispered. A very good one. She targets successful young doctors, particularly those with complicated family relationships or recent losses. She studies their vulnerabilities and exploits them. I thought about David's father's death, about how vulnerable and grateful he'd been for female companionship, about how Jessica had seemed to appear at exactly the right moment in his life. We have to tell David. Sarah closed her laptop and looked at me seriously. We can try. But Dorothy, if she's as good as she appears to be, she's already prepared for this possibility. She's probably been conditioning David to distrust anything that threatens their relationship. So, what do? We gather more evidence, and we hope that when the time comes, love is stronger than manipulation. Looking at my hospital badge, the same badge that had given Sarah access to the information that might save my son, I realized that sometimes the tools we use to heal can also be used to expose the truth. The background check report arrived in Sarah's email 3 days later. 23 pages of documentation that painted a picture more disturbing than we'd imagined. Sarah's contact at a private investigation firm had compiled a comprehensive dossier on the woman calling herself Jessica Monroe. Her real name was Jennifer Morgan, born in Akron, Ohio, 31 years old. The report detailed a criminal history spanning 8 states, fraud, identity theft, check kiting, and what the investigator termed romance scamming, the systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals for financial gain. Look at this timeline, Sarah said, spreading the pages across her desk. She's been perfecting this operation for over a decade. The pattern was meticulous. Jennifer would spend weeks researching potential targets through social media and professional networks. She'd learn about their careers, their families, their recent losses or transitions. Then she'd engineer a chance meeting, armed with enough information to seem like the perfect match. She doesn't just steal money, Sarah observed. She studies their psychology. Look at this profile from 2019. Dr. Thomas Kim in Seattle. Recently divorced, estranged from his family, workaholic tendencies. She presented herself as someone who understood the demands of medical careers. The Seattle case had ended when Dr. Kim's brother hired a private investigator after becoming suspicious of Jennifer's background. By then, she'd gained access to Kim's investment accounts and transferred over $80,000 to offshore accounts. She disappeared the night before their wedding. Sarah read aloud. Left a note claiming her mother had suffered a heart attack in another state. Kim tried to contact her for weeks before realizing he'd been conned. Each case followed similar patterns, but Jennifer had clearly learned from her mistakes. Her methods had become more sophisticated, her psychological manipulation more refined. This is the most troubling part, Sarah said, pointing to a psychological evaluation included in the report. The investigator consulted with a forensic psychiatrist. Jennifer displays characteristics of antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features. She's not just stealing money, she genuinely enjoys the psychological control. The report included transcripts of interviews with previous victims. Dr. Marcus Patterson from Hartford described how Jennifer had gradually isolated him from his family and friends. convincing him that they were jealous of his happiness and success. She made me believe that loving her meant choosing her over everyone else, Patterson had told the investigator. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd already alienated my parents, my siblings, my closest friends. She didn't just steal my money, she stole my support system. The financial aspects were equally disturbing. Jennifer had developed a sophisticated method of gaining access to her victims' accounts. She'd start with small requests: help with credit card payments, assistance with family emergencies. Once she'd established trust, she'd suggest combining finances for wedding planning, gradually gaining access to larger amounts. She's taken over $400,000 across 6 documented cases, Sarah said. And those are just the ones we know about. The psychological profile was the most chilling aspect of the report. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic psychiatrist, had analyzed Jennifer's patterns and concluded that she was likely a psychopath, someone incapable of genuine emotional connection, but highly skilled at mimicking it. Subjects like Jennifer often target individuals in caregiving professions. Dr. Foster had written, doctors, particularly those who've experienced recent losses, are ideal victims because they're trained to be empathetic and to trust their instincts about people. They're also typically financially stable and socially respected, making them valuable targets. The report detailed Jennifer's method of psychological manipulation: love bombing in the early stages, gradual isolation from support systems, gaslighting to make victims question their own perceptions, and finally, financial exploitation disguised as wedding planning or shared future goals. She's probably been studying David for months before they even met, Sarah realized. Look at this: she would have known about your husband's death, about David's close relationship with you, about his financial situation. The most disturbing revelation was in the final pages of the report. Jennifer had been using multiple identities simultaneously, maintaining active relationships with potential victims in different cities while pursuing David. She's currently engaged to 2 other men, Sarah said quietly, Dr. Robert Martinez, in Phoenix, and Dr. James Chen, in Portland. Different last name, but she obviously has a type. I stared at the photo of Dr. James Chen, young, Asian American, a cardiologist like his father had been. The similarities to David were unmistakable. She's targeting Asian American doctors specifically. It seems that way, the investigator thinks. She's identified cultural patterns that make this demographic particularly vulnerable to her manipulation: strong family bonds, respect for authority, reluctance to cause public embarrassment. The report concluded with a warning: Jennifer was becoming increasingly sophisticated and dangerous. Her recent victims had suffered not just financial losses but severe psychological trauma. 2 had required extensive therapy, 1 had attempted suicide, and several had been unable to maintain professional relationships or form new romantic connections. We have to stop her, I said. The question is how. If we go to David with this information, she's probably already prepared him to dismiss it as jealous interference from his controlling mother. Sarah was right. Jennifer had spent months conditioning David to distrust me, to interpret my concerns as attacks on his independence. Presenting him with evidence of his fiancée's criminal history might only confirm his belief that I was willing to do anything to destroy his happiness. What about the police? Romance scamming is notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the victim is unwilling to press charges. And technically, she hasn't stolen anything from David, yet the wedding is still 2 weeks away. I looked at the background check report, at the photos of Jennifer's previous victims, at the psychological profile that described her as a predator incapable of genuine emotion. Somewhere in that documentation was the key to saving my son. I just had to figure out how to use it. The financial records Sarah obtained through her contact at the bank painted an even grimmer picture. David's savings account, once containing nearly $50,000 built up over years of careful living and my occasional contributions, had been systematically drained over the past 6 months. Look at these transfers, Sarah said, pointing to the bank statements spread across my kitchen table. $15,000 for the ring, $20,000 for wedding deposits, $5,000 for what's listed as family emergency, $3,000 for temporary medical expenses. Each transaction was documented with David's digital signature. But the pattern was unmistakable. The withdrawals had started small and grown larger as Jennifer gained more control over his financial decisions. What's this one? I asked, pointing to a $10,000 transfer from just 2 weeks ago. Sarah checked her notes. According to the bank records, it was transferred to an account belonging to Monroe Wedding Planning Services. Guess who owns that company? Jennifer. Bingo. She created a shell company to funnel money from David's account to herself. Completely legal, completely devastating. But the financial theft was only part of the picture. Sarah had also obtained records showing that Jennifer had been using David's medical license number and hospital affiliations for various purposes. She'd applied for credit cards using his credentials, established vendor accounts with medical suppliers, and even attempted to secure a small business loan using his reputation as collateral. She's not just stealing his money, Sarah observed. She's stealing his professional identity. The most disturbing discovery came when Sarah accessed David's phone records through her connections in hospital administration. Jennifer had been monitoring his communications, reading his texts, listening to his voicemails. She knows every conversation he's had with you for the past 6 months, Sarah said. Every time you called, every message you sent, she was aware of all of it. This explained why Jennifer always seemed one step ahead of my attempts to reach David, why she always had responses prepared for my concerns, why David's reactions to my calls had become increasingly predictable and distant. She's been scripting his responses, I realized. More than that, look at this. Sarah showed me a pattern in the phone records. Every time you call David, Jennifer receives a notification. She's literally monitoring your relationship in real time. Evidence extended beyond financial and digital manipulation. Sarah had interviewed several of David's colleagues and discovered that Jennifer had been systematically isolating him from his professional support network as well. Dr. Michael Torres, David's closest friend from residency, revealed that Jennifer had convinced David to decline several social invitations and professional opportunities. She told him that networking events were shallow and that he should focus on building a life outside the hospital. Torres had told Sarah, but David used to love those conferences, those dinner parties with other doctors. It was how he stayed connected to the broader medical community. Jennifer had also influenced David's career decisions. She'd convinced him to turn down a fellowship opportunity at Johns Hopkins, arguing that it would interfere with their wedding plans and future family goals. She doesn't want him to have any independent success, Sarah observed. Everything has to revolve around her and their relationship. The psychological manipulation was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Jennifer's operation. Sarah had obtained copies of several self-help books from David's apartment hall, focused on toxic family relationships, setting boundaries with controlling parents, and building healthy adult relationships. She's been conducting a re-education campaign, Sarah said, literally teaching him to reinterpret your relationship through a lens that serves her purposes. Sarah had also discovered that Jennifer had been seeing a therapist not for her own issues, but to learn more effective manipulation techniques. She'd been attending sessions focused on family dynamics and boundary setting, essentially weaponizing therapeutic concepts against my relationship with David. It's brilliant and horrifying, Sarah admitted. She's using legitimate psychological principles to justify her manipulation. The scope of Jennifer's deception extended to her entire fabricated identity. She'd created fake social media profiles for non-existent family members, fabricated a professional network of colleagues and friends, and even staged phone calls with imaginary relatives to convince David of her authenticity. Remember when she had that family emergency last month? Sarah asked. I traced the phone number she claimed was her mother's hospital. It was a disconnected line that she'd been forwarding to her own phone. She literally acted out both sides of the conversation. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was evidence that Jennifer had been planning her exit strategy from the beginning. She'd already established new identities in other cities, complete with driver's licenses, social security numbers, and credit histories. She never intended to actually marry David, Sarah concluded. The wedding is just the final act of the con. After she disappears with whatever money she can extract, she'll move on to the next victim. Looking at the comprehensive evidence Sarah had gathered, financial records, communication logs, background checks, psychological profiles, realized that Jennifer wasn't just a criminal. She was a predator who had studied my son like a scientist studies a lab specimen, mapping his vulnerabilities, exploiting his grief, and systematically destroying the relationships that might threaten her control. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that facts alone wouldn't be enough to reach David. Jennifer had spent months conditioning him to distrust information that contradicted her narrative. Presenting him with documentation of her crimes might only convince him that I was willing to fabricate evidence to destroy his happiness. We need more than evidence, I told Sarah. We need proof that he can't dismiss or rationalize away. What did you have in mind? I looked at the financial records again, at the pattern of transfers and withdrawals, at the systematic theft that had been disguised as wedding planning. We need to catch her in the act. The recorded phone call I made to David 3 days before his wedding would haunt me for weeks afterward. Sarah had suggested we document my attempt to warn him, both as evidence for potential legal proceedings and as protection against Jennifer's inevitable accusations that I was trying to sabotage their marriage. I called David's phone at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, knowing he'd just finished his shift and would be driving home. The call went to voicemail twice before he finally answered, sounding tired and irritated. "Hi, Mom. David, I need to talk to you about something important. It's about Jessica." Immediately, I heard his voice become guarded, defensive. "Mom, we've talked about this. I'm not going to listen to you criticize my fiancée 3 days before my wedding. I'm not criticizing her. I have information you need to know. Information about her background. Information, or gossip and speculation, designed to make me doubt the woman I love." The response was so perfectly scripted, so clearly rehearsed, that I knew Jennifer had prepared him for this conversation. "David, please just listen. Jessica isn't who she claims to be. Her real name is Jennifer Morgan, and she's been running this same con on other doctors for years." Silence. Then, "Con. Mom, do you hear yourself right now? I have documentation, police reports, background checks, evidence of financial fraud. She's stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from men just like you. You hired investigators. You actually hired people to dig up dirt on my fiancé." The hurt in his voice was genuine, and it broke my heart. From his perspective, his mother had violated his privacy and his trust in the most fundamental way possible. "I had to protect you. Protect me. From what? From being happy. From having a life that doesn't revolve around managing your feelings. From being victimized by a criminal." "A criminal?" David's voice turned cold, distant. "Mom, I'm a doctor. I'm an intelligent, educated adult. Do you really think I'm so naive that I can't recognize if someone is lying to me? She's very good at what she does, David. She's had years of practice. She's had years of practice at what? Loving me, supporting my career, making me happier than I've been since Dad died." The mention of Robert hit me like a physical blow. Jennifer had clearly learned to weaponize David's grief, to frame her presence in his life as healing rather than harmful. "David, she's drained your savings account. She's used your medical credentials to establish credit accounts. She's monitoring your phone calls and manipulating your relationships. She's monitoring my phone calls." David laughed, but it was bitter, humorless. "Mom, you're having a paranoid breakdown. This is exactly the kind of behavior Jessica warned me about." Jessica warned me about. The phrase confirmed my worst fears. Jennifer had been preparing David for this conversation, inoculating him against the truth by predicting it would come from me. "I can prove everything I'm telling you, with forged documents, with lies from private investigators who'll say anything for money." "Mom, I know you're hurting. I know it's hard for you to accept that I'm building a life with someone else, but this conspiracy theory is insane." "It's not a conspiracy theory. Call Dr. Marcus Patterson in Hartford. Call Dr. James Rodriguez in Boston. Ask them about their experiences with Jessica." "You want me to call strangers and ask them about my fiancé based on your delusions? They're not strangers, David. They're victims, just like you're about to be." The line went quiet for a long moment. When David spoke again, his voice was barely controlled. "I need you to listen very carefully, Mom. I love Jessica. I'm going to marry her in 3 days. If you can't accept that, if you can't find a way to be happy for me, then maybe we need to reconsider our entire relationship." "David, I'm serious. Jessica was right when she said you might not be able to handle this transition. I hoped she was wrong, but clearly she knows you better than I thought." Jessica was right. Jessica knows you better than I thought. My son was quoting his manipulator's assessment of my character as if it were objective truth. "Please, just look at the evidence before you marry her." "I've seen enough evidence, Mom. I've seen 2 years of Jessica being patient with your hostility. I've seen her try to include you despite your constant criticism. I've seen her love me in ways that don't require me to choose between my happiness and your approval. I've never asked you to choose. You're asking me to choose right now. You're asking me to believe that the woman I love is a criminal based on nothing but your inability to let me go." The recording captured the sound of my heart, Racuna's sharp intake of breath, the rustling of papers as I reached for the evidence Sarah and I had compiled, the the silence that stretched between us like a chasm. "If you truly believe what you're telling me," David said finally, "then don't come to the wedding, because I won't have my marriage start with accusations and paranoia from the person who's supposed to love me most. I do love you most. Then, prove it. Let me be happy." The call ended with David hanging up, leaving me alone with the recorded evidence of my failure to save him. Sarah found me an hour later, sitting in my kitchen with the phone still in my hand. "He didn't believe you. Worse than that, I think I just convinced him that I'm exactly what she said. I was a controlling mother who can't accept his independence." Sarah played back parts of the recording, analyzing David's responses with her psychiatric training. "He's completely conditioned," she observed. "Every response was predictable, scripted. She's done this before, Dorothy. She knew exactly how this conversation would go. So what do we do now?" Sarah looked at the evidence we'd compiled, at the recordings and documents and proof that David had dismissed without consideration. "We hope that reality breaks through the conditioning before it's too late." 2 days later, I received Jessica's ultimatum in my mailbox, a formal disinvitation to the wedding, with a restraining order application attached. If I attempted to attend the ceremony or contact David before the wedding, I would be arrested for harassment. My son's wedding was happening in 24 hours, and I was banned from witnessing it. The wedding program I glimpsed through the church window was a masterpiece of fabrication. "Mr. and Mrs. William Monroe request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Jessica Ann Monroe to Dr. David Chen." The fake family history continued with fictional siblings, made-up colleges, and an entirely invented childhood. In Connecticut, standing outside St. Mark's Cathedral at 3 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, I felt like a ghost haunting my own son's life. The restraining order in my purse meant I couldn't go inside, couldn't take my rightful place in the front pew, couldn't witness the moment I'd dreamed about since David was born. Through the tall windows, I could see the guests assembling. David's medical school friends, colleagues from the hospital, distant relatives who'd traveled for the occasion. They were all inside celebrating while I stood on the sidewalk like a stranger, watching my son's life unfold without me. The church was more beautiful than I'd imagined. White roses and peonies adorned every pew, exactly as the inflated vendor contracts had promised. The lighting was soft and romantic, the music ethereal. Jennifer had indeed planned a perfect wedding with money stolen from my son and a guest list that excluded the woman who'd raised him. At 3:30, I watched David take his place at the altar. Even from a distance, through stained glass windows, I could see how handsome he looked in his black tuxedo. He was nervous, I could tell from the way he kept adjusting his tie, a habit he'd had since childhood whenever he was anxious. My heart ached watching him stand there alone. In the wedding, I'd imagined, I would have been there to calm his nerves, to whisper words of encouragement, to tell him how proud his father would have been. Instead, he was surrounded by groomsmen I'd never met, supported by friends Jennifer had approved of. When the processional music began, I pressed closer to the window. The bridesmaids were lovely, dressed in soft pink gowns that complemented the floral arrangements, but I didn't recognize any of them. More evidence that Jennifer's entire social circle was as fabricated as her family history. Then Jennifer appeared at the back of the church, and even I had to admit, she looked stunning. Her dress was silk with delicate beading, a cathedral train that flowed behind her like water. She'd chosen classic elegance over trendy fashion. Another calculated decision designed to appeal to David's traditional sensibilities. But watching her walk down the aisle, I saw what others missed. Her smile was perfect but practiced. Her tears were precisely timed. Every gesture was performed rather than felt. This wasn't a bride overwhelmed with joy. This was an actress delivering her finest performance. David's face, when he saw her, broke my heart in an entirely different way. His expression was one of pure love, genuine emotion, complete devotion. He believed he was marrying his soulmate, the woman who would share his life and build a future with him. He had no idea he was pledging himself to a predator. The ceremony progressed with traditional vows, readings about love and commitment that took on sinister undertones given what I knew about Jennifer's true intentions. When the minister asked if anyone had objections to the union, I actually stepped toward the church door before remembering the restraining order that would land me in jail. "Do you, Jessica Ann Monroe, take David to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the minister asked. "I do," she replied, her voice carrying clearly through the church windows. The lie was delivered with such conviction that I wondered if Jennifer had begun to believe her own performance. Perhaps after months of playing the role of loving fiancé, she'd lost track of where the con ended and reality began. Do you, David Chen, take Jessica to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. My son's voice was strong, certain, filled with the kind of love I'd only seen him express once before when he'd held his dying father's hand and promised to take care of me. The ring exchange was torture to witness. The $15,000 band David had bought with his life savings slipped onto Jennifer's finger like a shackle, binding him to a woman who would disappear with his money and his trust before their first anniversary. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, I found myself praying not for divine intervention, but for time. Time for David to discover the truth before Jennifer could complete her financial devastation. Time for him to realize that the woman he'd married was incapable of the love he was offering her. You may kiss the bride through the stained glass windows. I watched my son kiss a woman who had systematically destroyed his relationship with his mother, stolen his money, and would soon abandon him entirely. The congregation erupted in applause, celebrating a union built on deception and manipulation. But even as my heart broke watching David's happiness, I noticed something that gave me a flicker of hope. As Jennifer turned to face the congregation, her smile faltered for just a moment. Her eyes swept the crowd, and I could see her mentally calculating, counting faces, assessing potential threats, planning her next moves. This wasn't the expression of a woman beginning her new life with the man she loved. This was the look of a predator ensuring her escape routes remained clear. The recessional music began, and I watched David and Jennifer walk back down the aisle as husband and wife. David's face was radiant with joy. Jennifer's was a mask of perfect composure that couldn't quite hide the coldness underneath. As the wedding party filed out of the church, I retreated to my car. The reception would be starting soon, and I knew I couldn't bear to watch through windows as my son celebrated with a woman who was already planning to destroy him. But as I reached for my car keys, my pager began beeping urgently, the emergency code that meant a life hung in the balance somewhere in the city, and I was needed to save it. I was halfway to my car when I heard the commotion from inside the church. The recessional music had stopped abruptly, replaced by confused murmurs and the sound of chairs scraping against marble floors. Through the windows, I could see guests turning toward the altar, their celebratory expressions shifting to concern and confusion. Minister Davidson had stopped mid-blessing, his hand pressed to his ear as if listening to something through an earpiece. His face had gone pale, and he was looking directly at Jennifer with an expression I couldn't interpret from outside. Ladies and gentlemen, Minister Davidson's voice carried clearly through the church's acoustics. I need to interrupt the proceedings for a moment. The church fell silent. David and Jennifer had frozen at the altar, still holding hands but no longer looking like radiant newlyweds. Jennifer's perfect composure had cracked slightly. I could see tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was calculating escape routes. Mrs. Chen, Minister Davidson continued, and my heart stopped. He was looking directly toward the windows where I stood. Your hospital is trying to reach you. There's been a multi-car accident on Highway 95. They need you in surgery immediately. For a moment, I couldn't process what was happening. The minister was speaking to me, acknowledging my presence despite the restraining order that was supposed to keep me away. More importantly, he was calling me Mrs. Chen, not Dr. Chen, not Dorothy, but using the title that connected me to my son. Inside the church, David had turned toward the windows. Even from a distance, I could see his face cycling through emotions: surprise, confusion, and something that looked like relief. After months of being conditioned to see my absence as natural, hearing his childhood minister acknowledge my importance seemed to break through the programming. I'm sorry to interrupt your celebration, Minister Davidson continued, but Dr. Chen is one of the few surgeons in the state qualified to handle this type of trauma. Lives are depending on her expertise. Jennifer's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of showing concern for the emergency or pride in her new mother-in-law's skills, she looked furious. Her mask had slipped completely, revealing the calculating coldness underneath. She was angry that attention had shifted away from her performance, angry that I was being publicly acknowledged as someone important and necessary. David, she said, her voice carrying an edge that the wedding guests probably interpreted as concern but I recognized as control. Your mother can't just appear here when she was explicitly asked not to attend. But David wasn't listening to her. He was walking toward the church doors, toward me, with an expression I hadn't seen in months, the look of a son who remembered that his mother saved lives for a living. I met him at the church entrance, acutely aware that technically I was violating the restraining order, but no longer caring about legal consequences. David stopped a few feet away from me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. "Is it real?" he asked quietly. The emergency. I pulled out my pager, showing him the urgent code that was still flashing. Highway 95, multi-vehicle accident, multiple trauma victims en route. They need me in surgery in 20 minutes. David's medical training kicked in immediately. How many vehicles? What's the severity assessment? I don't know yet. I need to get to the hospital to find out. Behind David, I could see Jennifer approaching, her wedding dress rustling as she moved quickly across the marble floor. Her face was a study in barely controlled rage, and I realized that this interruption, this public reminder that I existed and mattered, was threatening to derail whatever final phase of her con she'd planned for the reception. "David, this is our wedding day," she said, placing a possessive hand on his arm. "Your mother's work emergency doesn't have to interrupt our celebration. People are dying, Jessica." David's voice carried a sharpness I hadn't heard him use with her before. "My mother is one of the best cardiothoracic surgeons in the state. If they're calling her on a Saturday afternoon, it means the situation is critical. But we have guests, we have a reception planned, we have rest of our lives to celebrate," David interrupted. "These patients have right now." I watched this exchange with a mixture of hope and heartbreak. For the first time in months, David was speaking like the man I'd raised, someone who understood that medicine was a calling, not just a career, someone who prioritized saving lives over social obligations. But I could also see Jennifer recalculating, adapting her approach to this unexpected development. She couldn't argue against saving lives without revealing her true nature, but she also couldn't let David reconnect with me without risking everything she'd worked for. "Of course," she said, her voice suddenly warm and understanding. "I'm sorry, Dorothy. I didn't realize how serious this was. David, you should go with your mother. Make sure she has everything she needs." The offer was a trap, and I knew it. Jennifer was betting that I would refuse David's help, that I would insist he stay with his new wife, thereby proving her point about my selfishness and control. Or perhaps she was planning to use his absence to implement whatever final phase of her scam she'd prepared for the reception. "No," I said firmly. "This is your wedding day, David. I can handle the surgery. You should be with your wife." "Mom, I've been handling emergencies alone for 5 years. I can handle this one too." I turned to leave, but David caught my arm. "Mom, wait." He looked back at Jennifer, then at me, and I could see him struggling with competing loyalties. "I'm proud of you, for what you do, for who you are. I've been so focused on starting my new life that I forgot to appreciate the life you gave me." The words were barely a whisper, but they hit me with the force of a revelation. This was my son, speaking, not Jennifer's carefully programmed version of him. For just a moment, the conditioning had cracked, and David was remembering who we used to be to each other. "Go save lives, Mom. That's what you do." As I walked toward my car, my pager continuing to beep urgently, I heard Minister Davidson's voice, resuming the ceremony behind me. But the interruption had changed something fundamental. Jennifer's perfect performance had been disrupted. David's programming had been challenged, and for the first time in months, I had hoped that my son might find his way back to the truth. The emergency was real, and people were counting on me. But as I drove toward the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that something even more critical was about to unfold back at that church. The surgical gloves snapped against my wrists as I entered Trauma Bay 2, where a 17-year-old girl lay unconscious with massive chest trauma from the highway accident. Her name was Maria Santos, the same age David had been when he'd first told me he wanted to become a doctor, the same age when he'd watched me save a child's life and decided that medicine was his calling. "What do we have?" I asked the trauma team, pushing thoughts of wedding receptions and family drama from my mind. This was where I belonged, where my training and experience could make the difference between life and death. 17-year-old female, driver in a head-on collision with a drunk driver, Dr. Martinez reported. Massive hemothorax, possible cardiac contusion, blood pressure dropping fast. "We've got her stabilized, but she needs immediate surgery." I looked at the monitors, the x-rays, the pale face of a girl who reminded me of every patient I'd ever fought to save. This was why I'd missed social events during David's childhood, why I'd studied late into the night, why I'd chosen medicine over easier paths, not for money or prestige, but for moments like this when everything I'd learned could save a life. Prep OR3, I ordered. Full cardiac bypass team on standby. Let's move. As we wheeled Maria toward surgery, my phone vibrated with a text from Sarah. Police are at the wedding. Something's happening. Stay focused on your patient. Police at the wedding. The words sent a chill through me, but I forced them from my mind. Maria Santos needed my complete attention, and I wouldn't let personal drama compromise her chances of survival. The surgery was complex and delicate. Maria's heart had been damaged by the impact, her major blood vessels torn, her chest cavity filled with blood. For 4 hours, I worked to repair the damage, my hands moving with the precision that came from 30 years of practice. Heart rate stabilizing, the anesthesiologist reported. Blood pressure coming up. Good. Let's check the repair on the left atrial wall. As I worked, muscle memory took over. This was the part of my life that Jennifer couldn't touch, couldn't manipulate, couldn't destroy. In the operating room, I was exactly who I'd always been, a surgeon dedicated to saving lives. A woman who'd spent decades perfecting her craft. Dr. Chen, one of the nurses, said quietly, "Your son is in the surgical waiting room." My hands never faltered, but my heart skipped. My son? Yes, ma'am. He's been here for about an hour. Says he needs to speak with you when you're finished. David was here, while his new wife was presumably at their reception, entertaining guests and cutting wedding cake. David had come to the hospital. The implications of that choice weren't lost on my head. Chosen medicine over celebration, duty over personal happiness, exactly as I'd raised him to do. How much longer? I asked the team. Closing now, Dr. Martinez replied. The repair looks good. She should make a full recovery. Excellent work, everyone. Let's get her to recovery. As I stripped off my surgical gloves and gown, I thought about Maria Santos sleeping peacefully under anesthesia, her heart beating strong and steady thanks to the skills I'd developed over decades of dedication. This was my legacy, not the money I'd saved or the sacrifices I'd made, but the lives I'd preserved. I found David in the surgical waiting room, still wearing his tuxedo but with his bow tie undone and his jacket draped over a chair. He looked exhausted, confused, and somehow younger than his 32 years. How's the patient? He asked when he saw me. She lived. Full recovery expected. Good. That's really good. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. David looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the right words. Why are you here, David? This is your wedding day. The police came to the reception, he said quietly. They arrested Jessica. The words hit me like a physical blow. Arrested her. For what? Fraud. Identity theft. Something about other victims in other states. David's voice was hollow, empty. They had evidence. Lots of evidence. They said she'd been running the same scam on doctors for years. I wanted to feel vindicated, to say I told you so, to point out that I'd tried to warn him. But looking at my son's devastated face, all I felt was sadness for his pain and relief that he'd escaped before more damage was done. I'm sorry, David. You knew, didn't you? That's what you were trying to tell me. I suspected. Sarah and I did some investigating, and I didn't believe you. I accused you of lying, of being jealous, of trying to control my life. David put his head in his hands. She played me perfectly, made me think loving her meant rejecting you. She's very good at what she does. The police said she'd stolen almost everything from my accounts. $50,000, gone. My credit cards maxed out, business loans taken out in my name. David looked up at me with tears in his eyes. I gave her everything, Mom. My money, my trust, my relationship with you. And it was all fake. I moved to sit beside him, close enough to offer comfort but respecting the distance that months of manipulation had created between us. The money can be recovered, your credit can be repaired. What matters is that you're safe. But us, can we be repaired too? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with months of hurt and misunderstanding. I thought about all the things I wanted to say about how much I'd missed him, how scared I'd been for him, how grateful I was that he'd escaped Jennifer's trap. But what came out was simpler and more honest. I never stopped loving you, David, not for a moment, even when I chose her over you, especially then. Because that's what love is, wanting someone to be happy, even when it breaks your heart. David reached for my hand, and for the first time in months, my son let me comfort him the way I had when he was small and the world seemed too big and scary to navigate alone. The police report Detective James Morrison handed me in the hospital cafeteria the next morning was 37 pages of documentation that revealed the full scope of Jennifer's criminal enterprise. As David and I read through it together, the magnitude of what he'd escaped became chillingly clear. Jennifer Morgan, also known as Jessica Monroe, Jessica Williams, Jessica Martinez, and Jessica Thompson, Detective Morrison explained, we've been tracking her for 2 years across 8 states. Your son's case gave us the evidence we needed to finally arrest her. The report detailed not just Jennifer's crimes, but her methods. She'd spent weeks researching potential targets through social media, professional networks, and medical society websites. She had specifically targeted doctors who'd experienced recent losses, deaths of parents or spouses, difficult divorces, career setbacks that left them emotionally vulnerable. She was particularly drawn to Asian American physicians, Detective Morrison continued. Our behavioral analyst believes she identified cultural patterns that made this demographic especially susceptible to her manipulation tactics. David's hands shook as he read the psychological profile. She studied me like a case study. More than that, I said, pointing to a section about Jennifer's preparation methods. Look at this. She spent 3 months researching you before engineering your first meeting. She knew about your father's death, your medical specialization, your financial status, even your favorite restaurants. The report revealed that their chance meeting at the hospital Christmas party had been anything but chance. Jennifer had obtained volunteer credentials specifically to gain access to the event, armed with detailed information about David's personal and professional life. She knew I'd lost my father. She knew I was close to my mother. She knew exactly what kind of woman would appeal to me, David said, his voice flat with realization. Detective Morrison nodded grimly. She's a professional. This isn't random crime, it's sophisticated psychological warfare designed to exploit specific emotional vulnerabilities. The financial aspects of the fraud were equally disturbing. Jennifer had established shell companies, fake businesses, and fraudulent credit accounts using David's information. The wedding planning had been a cover for systematic theft that went far beyond the obvious withdrawals from his savings account. She was planning to disappear the night after the wedding, Detective Morrison explained. We found evidence of travel bookings, new identity documents, and overseas bank accounts. If we hadn't arrested her when we did, your son would have woken up Monday morning to find his wife gone and his financial life destroyed. But the psychological manipulation was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Jennifer's operation. The report included transcripts of recorded conversations where she'd systematically conditioned David to distrust his own perceptions and prioritize her emotional needs over his established relationships. She used legitimate therapeutic techniques as weapons, I observed, reading through a section about her manipulation methods: gaslighting, boundary setting, trauma bonding. She turned healthy relationship concepts into tools of control. David found the section that detailed Jennifer's plan for isolating him from his support system. It was methodical, clinical, and terrifyingly effective. Phase 1: establish romantic connection through shared interests and emotional vulnerability. Phase 2: gradually increase dependence while subtly criticizing existing relationships. Phase 3: create loyalty tests that forced the victim to choose between the manipulator and their support system. Phase 4: financial integration and complete isolation. Phase 5: exit with maximum financial gain. We were in Phase 4 when we arrested her, Detective Morrison said. Phase 5 would have been devastating for your son. The report also revealed that David wasn't Jennifer's only current target. When police arrested her, she was simultaneously conducting romantic relationships with 2 other doctors in different cities, using different identities and nearly identical manipulation tactics: Dr. Robert Martinez in Phoenix and Dr. James Chen in Portland. Detective Morrison read from his notes. Both recent widowers, both cardiothoracic surgeons, both estranged from family members who'd expressed concerns about their relationships. James Chen, I said, remembering the background check Sarah had obtained. Another Asian American doctor with the same specialty as David. She has a very specific type, Detective Morrison confirmed. Successful, emotionally vulnerable, financially stable, and likely to inspire sympathy from juries if they press charges. David looked up from the report with haunted eyes. How many others were there? Confirmed victims across 6 states, total financial losses exceeding $400,000, but you should know most of her victims were too ashamed to press charges. The psychological manipulation was so effective that many of them blamed themselves for the relationship failures. The section about Jennifer's arrest at the wedding reception painted a dramatic picture. Police had arrived just as she was implementing what they believed was her exit strategy, creating a scene that would allow her to leave early while appearing to be the victim of family drama. She told the wedding guests that she'd received news of a family emergency, Detective Morrison explained. Our analysis suggests she was planning to use this as an excuse to leave the reception early. Access your son's accounts one final time and disappear before morning. The family emergency was fake. Everything about her family was fake. The parents who supposedly hosted the engagement party, the sister who was allegedly helping with wedding planning, the childhood friends from Connecticut, all fictional characters she'd created to support her cover story. David stared at a photo of Jennifer being led away in handcuffs, still wearing her wedding dress. I married a complete stranger. You married a professional criminal who'd studied you for months and crafted a personality designed to exploit your specific vulnerabilities. I corrected gently. That's not your fault, David. That's hers. Detective Morrison closed the report and looked at both of us seriously. The good news is that we caught her before the major financial damage was done. Most of your money can be recovered. Your credit can be repaired, and she'll be going to prison for a very long time. What happens now? David asked. Now you begin the process of healing from psychological trauma that's more complex than most people realize. We're recommending counseling with specialists who understand manipulation victims, and will need your testimony when this goes to trial. As Detective Morrison left us alone in the cafeteria, David and I sat in silence, processing the enormity of what we'd learned. The woman who'd nearly destroyed our relationship and stolen David's future was now in custody, but the damage she'd inflicted would take time to fully understand and repair. I'm scared, Mom, David admitted quietly. Scared about how easily I was manipulated. Scared about what else I might have missed. Scared about whether I'll ever be able to trust my own judgment again. I reached across the table and took his hand. You will, because now you know what to look for. Now you understand how manipulation works. That knowledge will protect you going forward. Will you help me? With the recovery? With the legal stuff? With figuring out how to rebuild my life? David, I've been waiting 2 years for you to ask me that question. David's handwritten apology letter arrived at my house 3 days after Jennifer's arrest. Delivered personally because he said he needed to face me when I read it. The paper was covered in his careful physician's handwriting. The same neat script I'd watched him practice as a child when he was learning to write prescriptions. Dear Mom, it began. I don't know if there are words to express how sorry I am for what I've put you through these past 2 years. I don't know if there are actions that can make up for the pain I've caused, but I need to try to explain what happened, not to excuse my behavior, but to help you understand how completely I lost myself. David sat across from me in my kitchen, as I read, the same kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals, homework sessions, and conversations about his future. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the realization of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. I started reading about psychological manipulation after the arrest, he said when I finished the letter. I wanted to understand how someone like me, someone with medical training, someone who should understand human behavior, could be so completely deceived. And what did you learn? That intelligence doesn't protect you from emotional manipulation. That grief and trauma create vulnerabilities that skilled predators can exploit. That isolation is the most powerful tool manipulators have. Once they separate you from your support system, they can control your entire reality. David had spent the previous days retracing his relationship with Jennifer, identifying the specific moments when her influence had shifted his perceptions. The process was painful but necessary, like a surgeon identifying diseased tissue before removing it. The worst part is realizing how she used Dad's death against me, he continued. She positioned herself as someone who could heal that grief, while simultaneously convincing me that you were keeping me trapped in the past. She was very good at finding emotional pressure points. She made me believe that loving her meant rejecting you, that becoming a man meant choosing between my wife and my mother. She turned loyalty into betrayal and independence into cruelty. I could see David struggling with the cognitive dissonance, reconciling the woman he thought he loved with the criminal who'd systematically destroyed his life. It was like mourning someone who'd never actually existed. I keep thinking about all the times you tried to warn me, all the times I dismissed your concerns as jealousy or control. You were trying to save me, and I interpreted it as an attack on my happiness. Jennifer had months to condition your responses. I had minutes to try to break through years of psychological programming. The recording she played me of me complaining about why remembered making those comments, but what I didn't realize was how she'd manipulated the conversations that led to them. She'd spend hours convincing me that your behavior was problematic, then record my frustrated responses as evidence. David pulled out his phone and showed me messages he'd discovered, text conversations with Jennifer, where she'd systematically reframed every interaction between us as evidence of my supposed toxicity. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a conversation from 6 months ago. "You called to invite us to dinner, and Jessica immediately started texting me about how demanding you were being, how you couldn't respect our boundaries, how I needed to choose between keeping you happy and building a healthy relationship with her." The messages were masterfully manipulative, each one building on the previous conditioning, each one making David's love for his mother seem like a character flaw he needed to overcome. "She even had me believing that missing you was unhealthy," David said, his voice breaking, "that wanting to talk to my mother every day was a sign of emotional immaturity. David, you don't need to catalog every manipulation. What matters is that you recognize them now. But I do need to understand, because if I don't understand how this happened, how can I trust myself not to fall for it again?" We spent the afternoon going through David's finances, assessing the damage Jennifer had inflicted. The numbers were staggering, not just the obvious thefts, but the hidden damage to his credit, his professional reputation, his future security. She maxed out credit cards I didn't even know she'd opened, David discovered, used my medical license number to establish vendor accounts, took out loans, using my credentials as collateral, all recoverable with proper legal action. "It's not about the money, Mom. It's about how easily she convinced me to give her access to everything: my bank accounts, my passwords, my professional credentials. I trusted her completely." The psychological inventory was even more devastating than the financial one. David had lost not just money, but relationships, professional opportunities, and his sense of self. Jennifer had isolated him so thoroughly that he'd almost forgotten who he was before she entered his life. "I turned down the Johns Hopkins Fellowship because of her," he realized. "She convinced me that accepting it would be selfish, that it would interfere with our wedding plans and future family goals. You can reapply for next year's program, cannot." After what happened, after how publicly I was deceived, how can I trust my judgment about career decisions? How can I trust my judgment about anything? This was the deepest damage Jennifer had inflicted, not just stealing David's money, but destroying his confidence in his own perceptions, his own decisions, his own worth. "David, look at me." I waited until he met my eyes. "You are still the same intelligent, compassionate, skilled doctor you were before you met her. Her manipulation doesn't change your fundamental character or abilities, but I let her convince me that you were the problem. I chose a criminal over my mother. You chose what you believed was love over what you'd been conditioned to see as control. That's not a character flaw, that's human nature being exploited by someone with years of practice." David was quiet for a long moment, processing the distinction between his actions and his character, between being victimized and being weak. "I want to rebuild our relationship," he said finally, "but I don't know how. I don't know how to trust my own feelings when they've been so manipulated. I don't know how to separate genuine emotion from programmed responses." We take it slowly. We talk honestly about what happened and what we want going forward. We rebuild trust gradually, with actions rather than just words. And you're willing to do that. After everything I put you through, I thought about the past 2 years, the isolation, the rejection, the pain of watching my son be systematically turned against me. But I also thought about the alternative reality where Jennifer had succeeded completely, where David had disappeared from my life forever. "David, you're my son. You're the best thing I've ever done with my life. There's nothing you could do that would make me stop fighting for our relationship." For the first time since the arrest, David smiled, not the practiced expression Jennifer had trained him to display, but the genuine warmth I remembered from his childhood. "I love you, Mom. I never stopped loving you, even when I convinced myself I had to choose between love and independence. I love you too." And now we begin the real work of healing. The court sentencing document I held 6 months later was more than just legal paperwork. It was validation that the nightmare David and I had endured was real, documented, and finally ending. Jennifer Morgan had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud, identity theft, and racketeering across multiple states. The defendant demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. Judge Patricia Williams had stated during sentencing, her crimes caused not just financial damage, but profound emotional trauma to victims who trusted her with their hearts, their futures, and their families. David and I sat in the courtroom's front row as Jennifer's other victims gave their impact statements. Each story was heartbreakingly similar. Successful professionals who'd been systematically isolated from their support systems, financially exploited, and emotionally devastated by a woman who'd studied them like case studies. Dr. Marcus Patterson from Hartford took the stand first, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly as he described the aftermath of Jennifer's abandonment. "She didn't just steal my money," he testified. "She stole my ability to trust my own judgment. After she disappeared, I spent months questioning every decision I'd made, every relationship I'd valued. She made me doubt not just her, but myself." Dr. James Rodriguez from Boston described how Jennifer had convinced him to cut ties with his elderly parents, claiming they were too controlling and judgmental. "I missed my father's funeral because of her manipulation," he said, tears streaming down his face. "She convinced me that attending would be emotionally unhealthy, that I needed to prioritize our relationship over family obligations. He died thinking I didn't love him." Each testimony revealed the same pattern: isolation, followed by exploitation, love bombing, followed by systematic destruction of the victim's support network and self. But what struck me most was the courage these men showed in speaking publicly about their experiences. When David's turn came to testify, he walked to the witness stand with the same determined stride I'd watched him use when approaching difficult surgeries. His voice was clear and strong as he described Jennifer's impact on his life. "The defendant didn't just defraud me financially," he stated, looking directly at Jennifer for the first time since her arrest. "She nearly destroyed my relationship with my mother, the person who raised me, supported my dreams, and loved me unconditionally. She weaponized my grief over my father's death to isolate me from the woman who'd helped me survive that loss." David's testimony was devastating in its clarity. He detailed specific manipulation techniques Jennifer had used, the gradual erosion of his relationships, and the systematic financial exploitation that had occurred under the guise of wedding planning. "But perhaps most insidiously," David continued, "she made me complicit in my own isolation. She convinced me that rejecting my mother's love was a sign of maturity, that choosing between my fiancé and my family was normal and healthy, turned my capacity for love into a weapon against the people who actually cared about me." Jennifer showed no emotion during any of the testimonies. She sat beside her court-appointed attorney with the same calculating expression I'd observed at the wedding reception, even now seeming to analyze the proceedings for strategic advantage. When the prosecutor read the final charges, counts of fraud, 12 counts of identity theft, conspiracy to commit racketeering, Jennifer's only response was a slight tightening around her eyes. No remorse, no acknowledgement of the devastation she'd caused. No recognition that her victims were human beings rather than targets. "The court finds that the defendant poses a significant danger to the community," Judge Williams declared. "Her crimes were not impulsive acts of desperation, but calculated campaigns of psychological warfare designed to exploit the most fundamental human need for love and connection." The 12-year sentence felt like justice, but I knew the real healing would take much longer. The other victims and their families had formed an informal support network, sharing resources for therapy, legal assistance, and financial recovery. We'd learned that trauma from psychological manipulation required specialized treatment that most people didn't understand. After the sentencing, David and I joined several other families for lunch at a restaurant near the courthouse. The conversation was both heartbreaking and healing, stories of betrayal mixed with accounts of gradual recovery, shared understanding that helped combat the isolation Jennifer had created. "The hardest part is trusting new people," Dr. Patterson admitted. "Every time someone shows interest in my life, I wonder what they're really after." Jennifer was so good at mimicking genuine emotion that I second-guess every interaction now. "The therapy helps," Dr. Rodriguez added, "but it's slow. I'm learning to separate Jennifer's manipulation from my own intuition. but it's like relearning how to walk after a devastating injury. David nodded thoughtfully. I've started dating again, very carefully. But I find myself analyzing every conversation, looking for signs of manipulation that might not even be there. Jennifer didn't just steal my money, she stole my ability to trust, love. As we drove home from the courthouse, David was unusually quiet. The sentencing had provided closure, but it had also forced him to relive the trauma in vivid detail. Are you okay? I asked. I keep thinking about what the prosecutor said, that Jennifer was likely planning her next victims while she was with me, that even on our wedding day, she was already moving on to her next targets. That says everything about her character and nothing about yours. I know that intellectually, but emotionally, it's hard not to feel like a complete fool. David, look at the other victims who testified today. Successful doctors, intelligent professionals, caring people who wanted to believe in love. Jennifer's success wasn't due to their stupidity, was due to her skill as a predator. The judge was right about one thing: she weaponized our capacity for love against us. Made us think that loving her required rejecting everyone else who cared about us. As we pulled into my driveway, David reached over and squeezed my hand. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I'd given up on us. That's what mothers do, sweetheart. We love you through the darkness until you find your way back to the light. The court documents in my purse represented more than legal victory. They represented validation that our pain was real, our trauma was recognized, and justice was possible, even in cases of sophisticated psychological manipulation. The new family photo on my mantle was taken 18 months after Jennifer's sentencing. At David's second attempt at a wedding, this time to Dr. Emily Foster, a trauma surgeon he'd met through our victim support group. Emily understood psychological manipulation because she'd experienced it herself in a previous relationship, and she and David had built their connection on honesty, transparency, and mutual healing. But more importantly, the photo showed something I'd feared I might never see again: my son's genuine smile, free from the calculated performance Jennifer had trained him to display. David looked older, wiser, marked by experience but not broken by it. I can't believe how different I look, David said, comparing the new photo to pictures from his first wedding. In the wedding photos with Jennifer, I look happy, but there's something artificial about it, like I was performing happiness rather than feeling it. Jennifer taught you to perform emotions that served her purposes, rather than expressing emotions that were genuinely yours, I observed. It takes time to rediscover authentic feelings after that kind of conditioning. The healing process had been slower and more complex than either of us had anticipated. David had spent months in therapy, working with specialists who understood manipulation, trauma. He'd had to relearn how to trust his own perceptions, how to identify genuine emotions versus programmed responses, how to form relationships based on mutual respect rather than psychological dependency. The therapist had me keep an emotion journal, David explained. Every day, I had to write down what I was feeling and why, then analyze whether those feelings were my authentic responses or learned behaviors from Jennifer's conditioning. What did you discover? That I'd been performing emotions for so long that I'd almost forgotten what genuine feelings felt like. Jennifer had trained me to feel guilty when I missed you, anxious when I made decisions without consulting her, ashamed when I expressed opinions that differed from hers. The process of rebuilding our relationship had required similar intent. We'd attended family therapy sessions together, working through the specific ways Jennifer's manipulation had damaged our bond and developing new patterns of communication based on honesty rather than fear. I had to learn that loving you didn't make me weak or dependent, David reflected. Jennifer had convinced me that close family relationships were somehow incompatible with adult independence, and I had to learn that your need for independence didn't mean rejection of our relationship, I added. Jennifer exploited both of our insecurities, your fear of being controlled and my fear of being abandoned. The financial recovery had been more straightforward than the emotional healing. Most of David's money had been recovered through asset forfeiture, insurance claims, and restitution orders. His credit had been repaired, his professional reputation restored, and he'd even been accepted into the Johns Hopkins Fellowship program he'd originally turned down. But the psychological recovery was ongoing. David still struggled with trust issues, still analyzed new relationships for signs of manipulation, still questioned his own judgment in ways that broke my heart. I met Emily's parents last weekend, he told me during one of our weekly dinner tradition we'd re-established after months of careful rebuilding. And I found myself looking for signs that they were trying to manipulate me or control Emily's decisions. That's a normal protective response after what you experienced. But Emily noticed my defensiveness. She asked me afterward if I was okay, if something about her family had concerned me. And I realized I was projecting Jennifer's manipulation patterns onto people who were just trying to get to know me. This was the ongoing challenge of recovery, learning to distinguish between legitimate caution and trauma-induced hypervigilance, between healthy boundaries and defensive isolation. The difference is that Emily asked you directly about your concerns instead of dismissing them or using them against you. I pointed out, that's how healthy relationships work, with direct communication rather than manipulation. David's relationship with Emily had developed slowly, with extensive communication about their respective trauma histories and careful attention to maintaining their individual support systems. Emily encouraged David's relationship with me, just as I supported their developing bond. Emily actually suggested that she and I go to lunch together. David said, "She wants to get to know you better. Not because she's trying to manage our relationship, but because she understands that loving me means respecting the people who are important to me." The contrast with Jennifer's approach was stark. Where Jennifer had systematically isolated David from his support system, Emily actively encouraged those connections. Where Jennifer had demanded exclusive loyalty, Emily celebrated David's capacity for multiple loving relationships. "She reminds me of Dad in some ways," David observed. "The way she supports my career without trying to control it, the way she encourages my relationship with you, the way she makes me feel stronger rather than dependent." Robert would have loved Emily, I was certain. He would have appreciated her intelligence, her integrity, and most importantly, her understanding that love multiplies rather than divides when it's genuine. "I've been thinking about the wedding," David said carefully. "Emily and I want something small, intimate, just close family and friends. But I'd like you to be involved in the planning this time, really involved, not just tolerated. I'd be honored, and I want to have that mother-son dance that Jennifer refused to allow." Emily suggested it, actually. She said every groom should have the chance to honor the woman who raised him. The mother-son dance I'd dreamed about for 32 years, stolen by Jennifer's manipulation, now offered freely by a woman who understood that celebrating love didn't require diminishing it. "What song would you want to dance to?" I asked. "In My Daughter's Eyes" by Martina McBride. I know it's written from a daughter's perspective, but the lyrics about seeing yourself through the eyes of someone who loves you unconditionally, that's how I want to see myself again, through your eyes, the way I did before Jennifer taught me to see myself through her distorted lens. As we planned his second wedding, I was struck by how different the process felt. Instead of being excluded and diminished, I was included and valued. Instead of my opinions being dismissed as controlling, they were welcomed as expressions of love. Instead of being treated like a threat to David's happiness, I was recognized as a source of his strength. "Thank you for not giving up on me," David said as we looked through wedding venue brochures together. "Thank you for fighting for our relationship even when I couldn't see that it was worth fighting for. David, you are the greatest accomplishment of my life. There was never any question of giving up on you." The new family photo represented more than recovered relationships. It represented the triumph of authentic love over sophisticated manipulation, the resilience of genuine bonds over artificial dependency, and the possibility of healing even after devastating betrayal. The thank you card from Maria Santos arrived on the second anniversary of Jennifer's sentencing. 2 years after I'd saved the 17-year-old's life while my son's world collapsed around him. Maria was now a pre-med student at the state university, and her card included a photo of her at her graduation ceremony, healthy, vibrant, alive because of a surgery that had taken me away from a wedding that wasn't really a wedding at all. "Dr. Chen," her card read, "I know you probably don't remember me, but you saved my life 2 years ago after my car accident. I wanted you to know that I'm now studying to become a surgeon myself, inspired by the woman who gave me a second chance at life. Thank you for choosing to heal rather than hate, to save rather than surrender. Your dedication to medicine saved not just my life, but showed me what I want to do with the life you preserved." I showed the card to David during our weekly dinner, a tradition that had evolved from cautious rebuilding to comfortable routine over the past 2 years. He read it carefully, then looked up with the same expression he'd worn as a child when he first understood that medicine was about more than science. It was about hope. "You were exactly where you needed to be that day," he said, "saving her life instead of watching me make the biggest mistake of mine." "Sometimes I think about the timing," I admitted. "If that emergency hadn't come when it did, if Minister Davidson hadn't called me out publicly, if you hadn't been reminded of who I really was beneath Jennifer's manipulation, but it did happen that way, and maybe that wasn't coincidence." David had changed in ways that went beyond recovering from Jennifer's manipulation. The experience had deepened his empathy, sharpened his understanding of human vulnerability, and strengthened his commitment to medicine as a calling rather than just a career. "I've been thinking about specializing in trauma surgery," he told me. "Working with patients who've experienced sudden, life-changing events. Understanding psychological manipulation has made me better at recognizing when patients' families are truly supportive versus when they might be harmful. That's important work." Emily and I have been volunteering with the Victim Support Group to helping other professionals recognize the signs of sophisticated manipulation before they lose everything. This had become David's mission, using his experience as Jennifer's victim to help others avoid similar traps. He'd spoken at medical conferences about psychological manipulation targeting healthcare professionals, written articles for medical journals about recognizing emotional predators, and consulted with law enforcement on romance scamming cases. "The FBI asked me to review a case last week," he continued. "A cardiologist in Denver who's being targeted by someone using Jennifer's exact playbook. Same research methods, same isolation techniques, same fake family history. Were you able to help?" "We think so." The victim was willing to listen because the warning came from another doctor who'd been through the same experience. Sometimes it takes someone who's been manipulated to recognize manipulation in progress. This work had given David's trauma a purpose, transforming his victimization into advocacy that might protect others. He'd testified before Congress about the need for better legal protections against psychological manipulation, consulted with medical schools about including manipulation awareness in their curricula, and helped establish support networks for professionals targeted by sophisticated con artists. But perhaps most importantly, David had learned to trust his own judgment, again while remaining appropriately cautious about new relationships. His marriage to Emily was built on the foundation of shared understanding, mutual respect, and transparent communication that would have been impossible with someone like Jennifer. "Emily's pregnant," he announced quietly, setting down his fork and looking at me with an expression that mixed joy with nervousness. "David, that's wonderful news. We just found out yesterday." We're both excited and terrified in equal measure. "That's normal for new parents. But what if I mess this up? What if I can't tell the difference between healthy boundaries and harmful isolation when it comes to protecting my child? What if I can't recognize if someone is trying to manipulate them the way Jennifer manipulated me?" These were the ongoing concerns that trauma survivors carried, not just about their own vulnerability, but about their ability to protect the people they loved from similar predators. "David, you'll be a wonderful father precisely because you understand how manipulation works. You'll teach your child to trust their instincts while being appropriately cautious. You'll show them what healthy relationships look like by example. Will you help with the baby, with making sure I don't repeat patterns I might not even recognize? I'd be honored to be this child's grandmother." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, contemplating the future that stretched ahead of future, that included new life, continued healing, and the gradual rebuilding of trust that Jennifer had nearly destroyed. "I've been thinking about Dad lately," David said, "about what he would think of everything that's happened. What do you think he'd say?" "I think he'd be proud of how we survived it, how we fought for each other even when it seemed impossible, how we turned something that could have destroyed us into something that made us stronger." Robert would indeed be proud, I realized. He'd be proud of David's resilience, of my determination to save our relationship, of the way we'd refused to let Jennifer's manipulation permanently damage our bond. "Your father always said that love isn't fragile, it's the strongest force in the universe when it's genuine. Jennifer tried to convince you that love was weakness, that caring deeply made you vulnerable, but it was our love that ultimately saved us both. And now we get to share that love with the next generation." The thank you card from Maria Santos reminded me of something I'd always known but had almost forgotten during the darkest days of Jennifer's manipulation, that the work we do, the love we give, the lives we touch create ripples that extend far beyond our immediate understanding. I'd saved Maria's life while my son was being victimized. Maria became a doctor inspired by that experience. David used his victimization to help other potential victims. Our story of manipulation and recovery would help other families recognize and resist similar predators. The baby will have an amazing legacy, I told David. Grandparents who fought for love, parents who understand the difference between authentic and manipulative relationships, and a family that knows the value of genuine connection. And they'll have a grandmother who saves lives for a living, David added with a smile, who shows up when people need her most, even when it's difficult or painful or complicated. As we finished dinner and planned for a future that included new life and continued healing, I realized that Jennifer's attempt to destroy our family had ultimately strengthened it. We'd learned the difference between love and manipulation, between support and control, between healthy boundaries and harmful isolation. The thank you card from Maria Santos would go in my office, next to the new family photo that showed David's genuine smile and the court documents that confirmed Jennifer's imprisonment. Together, they represented the full story: manipulation and recovery, trauma and healing. The darkness that threatens to consume us and the light that ultimately guides us home. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding battle, but from surviving it with our capacity for love intact.